welcome to a very special podcast which signals the start of our International Law and Islamic Law Symposium. Today we are very happy to be joined by Ahmer Bilal Soofi, who is the founder of the law firm ABS & Co, as well as the think tank Research Society of International Law, and he has also written this fantastic book on an introduction to Quranic Covenants, after which he established the Qur'an Covenant Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure is mine, Ayesha. Thank you very much for inviting.
So I wanted to start off by asking you that as someone who is so deeply now involved in this field, how has your understanding of Quranic covenants evolved over time, and what motivated you to write this book?
Well, actually, when you were studying international law for most of your life and also practicing, so you have a very clear insight into global transactional work, business, and other issues, state to state, and so on. Now, while doing all that, we also know there are so many treaties, international conventions, and about 51 Muslim states are there. So 2 billion people in the world, approximately around that number, follow Islam as their religion and they internalize it. So therefore, if we are able to somehow find a connection between the modern laws, treaties, and contracts with this internalization of the faith, then obviously the compliance would be voluntary as opposed to being enforced forcefully and so on. So this was something that was bearing with me for a long time during my work. I was advising at some point OIC, Secretary General Office on International Law. So I had occasion to participate in Geneva debates and so on, and that again, this dimension came to my cognizance that there is this aspect that needs to be looked in. Then I was periodically invited by various schools and various venues where we had Islamic scholars, and that's where I talked about that Islam places enormous premium on upholding international law, international treaties, and such covenants. So therefore, we should identify this commonality as a basis to create voluntariness to comply. Again, the feedback was very good when I worked on that, and that's how in 2021 I was unwell, born bed rest, and that's where I found time to work more deeply into that, and that's where this formulation developed, and I realized that the covenant is one of the basic structural features of the Quran. It's a covenantal framework. There are constant promises, personal promises by the revealer of the Quran with the subjects of the Quran. There are covenants of consignee, consignor. There's a covenant of access. There's a covenant of giving a certain assurances, warranties, representations about the power, and so on. So not only the legal architecture is self-evident, but at the same time, there is a covenantal, so many promises being identified. So while the word Misak or Ahad has been mentioned a few times, but structurally there are so many covenants that one could identify. So that's where this work started, and that's when I realized that this is something that needs to be looked into.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting having read the book in terms of it bridging that gap between countries claiming that they hold Islamic law to be of such importance and what that means for their international obligations. So could you explain for the benefit of our viewers what Quranic covenants are and what is their position in terms of Islamic theology?
Islamic theology has been working in the area of Usul Fiqh and relating to Usul Fiqh and Maqasid Sharia, which basically means what is the reason, what is the purposes of creating this entire jurisprudence at a worldly level. But it has been also recognized by some top scholars like Joseph Lombard that there is a gap in the scholarship and not much has been looked into from a covenantal framework. So this work makes an effort to fill that gap. And this basically identifies 3 sets of covenants. So the first set of covenant is personal covenant, which is about 30 or 35 covenants which have been identified. Now for that, the constituency is that of the believers. The other set is the social covenants. Social covenant means which are relatable to the society, and if you do what you do, then you are assured a certain reward for doing it. Rule of law and so on and so forth. And then these are all covenants in the Quran. Another important category is the covenants under the Quran. And there are three. The covenant that we do every day, the promises we make, the trade treaties we do, the trade agreements we do, the transactional work that is done. So everyday contracts like buying a land and agreeing to someone to do certain things, purchase orders, agreement of supply of goods, carriage of goods agreement, all these from a believer's perspective are covenants and contracts under the Quran.
Right.
And that's what one of our legendary lawyers, A.K. Buroi Sahab, he wrote a well-known work called Fundamental Laws of Pakistan, and he mentioned that for a Muslim, for a believer, every commercial contract is actually a trilateral contract. And in one party is Allah himself.
Okay.
Because he will be asking us that you made these commitments to Mr. X, Mr. Y, with family members, friends, colleagues, employees, employers, and business partners. So what have you done with it? Have you fulfilled that commitment or not? So in that sense, Mr. Buroi said that every contract that a Muslim does is actually a trilateral contract.
Right.
Whereas we just look at it very limited sense. And people tend to walk out of contracts. They sometimes have second thoughts about what they've agreed. And each time you have a second thought on agreement, you want to reflect, you want to redo it, you want to look back, you have done something which you could repair. That leads to litigation, and that litigation then piles up a huge stress on the enforcement side of the legal commitments in the society. So if people were to realize that if they are entering into a private treaties, private contracts, private arrangements with everybody, and they have to uphold it because they will not only be answerable here, but they will be answerable in the jurisdiction hereafter, then obviously the compliance will be voluntary and the stress on the judicial enforcement side will also be dramatically reduced.
And I'm interested in how this is on an individual level. But in terms of the covenants that you look at in the book, you look at it in terms of contracts, but also as well treaties and legislative covenants. So I was hoping if you could go through that a little bit in terms of how it applies to contracts, but also treaties and also to legislative covenants.
I think when I look at the word Misaq and Ahad in the Quran, and there's very clear directions in the Quran that you have to uphold what you agree, whatever you say. So the Quran contract law tells us that you need to uphold whatever you say. And then there's a Quran treaty law that I call QTL. Quran treaty law is telling us that if you have to uphold treaties that you do with other tribes. That was the situation then, but today it will be read as between states, multilateral conventions, international agreements, bilateral treaties that need to be upheld. So the Quran treaty law is insisting to uphold, failing which those who are entering into such treaties, they'll be answerable for that. So in other words, for a Muslim, he has to be a responsible citizen of the world and responsible citizen of his own state. He is expected not to enter into disputes or create what is known as disruption of law and order in Arabic called fasad. He has to avoid that thing. So for that, the order of every society is governed by contractual or legal framework. So a contract is, as someone said in the Supreme Court judgment, a contract is basically a private legislation between two parties. So two individuals agree how their relationship will be governed under a contractual regime. Likewise, under international treaties, you regulate relationship amongst the states. So they are also falling in the definition of Misaq and Ahad, and therefore, for believer countries or Muslim countries, they have a duty to uphold whatever they commit under international law. So all conventions that Muslim countries have signed, Pakistan has signed, we have a duty to uphold them. Whether they are the conventions relating to cultural property protection, we have to uphold that. Whether they are conventions relating to environment, climate, we have to uphold them. Whether they are international law related conventions relating to human rights, we have to uphold them. Whether they are relating to countering terrorism and so on, we have to money laundering or whatever, to transnational crimes, drug crimes. If we have ratified them, we have to uphold them not only as a matter of national duty, but if we are a believer, as a matter of a personal duty towards our religion.
And it's very interesting that this all goes to contribute towards law and order. So what I'm interested in is the opposite of that. So what about war? And you have a section in this which relates to jihad, and it's now such a bad word in the West, but for us it's a very normal term in Islamic law. So what do you think about that as being a different kind of covenant in that you put it in the category of social covenants?
Well, I've put this in a covenant, social covenant, because obviously Quran clearly says those who are willing and ready to do jihad, they will be rewarded. So there is a clear covenant with them for being ready for carrying out jihad. Now, jihad has been defined in a narrow sense and in a larger context. In a narrow sense means jihad bin nafs, fighting against every forces that are inducing you towards the wrong direction. But from a combat point of view, the entire jihad jurisprudence, if you examine that and you compare it with the modern international law framework, you will find incredible similarities, or at least I found that. I found that jihad, whatever it has been talked about, is very similar to what modern international law talks about. So today, in modern international law has come aside the treaty formulations, through state practice, the whole idea of humanitarian intervention or the responsibility to protect doctrine is absolutely in sync with what jihad principles are under the Quran treaty law. So the Quran treaty law is very specific, and therefore, and you have to read it to come to a right conclusion with the sunnah of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, because he just like Geneva Conventions framework or IHL framework, you can take out a target if he is in a combat mode. But if he is unarmed, you should not kill him. Because he's now become a non-Muslim or a non-believer, and you have to give him an opportunity to convert to be a believer out of his own free will. Free will is a very primary aspect of the Quranic framework. You should not force anyone to change belief. It is something that you need to document the information for his knowledge, and he has to make up his mind. We don't coerce them. So if the Quran talks about the punishment, it is more in the nature of creating a deterrence but not coercion. So believers are specifically told to protect the right of minorities. Otherwise, so you have to read the jihad with the concept of free will and with the concept of protection of minorities as a package. So therefore, my views are that modern international law is not in variance with the principles of jihad as they were originally conceived. Likewise, the third aspect that I think you asked me was about the legislative covenants to upholding. They are also covenants under the Quran. Why? Because every legal instrument that a country has is actually a social contract with the state. We know in the political science theory that constitution is a social contract between a citizen and the state. So the moment it is a contract, it is presumed to be a covenant under the Quran, authorized under it, because now every citizen has to uphold the discipline of the state. He has to extend loyalty to the state constitution and the laws made thereunder. So each law becomes a legislative covenant. So if he has this mental intent or this niyat that he is fulfilling the mandate pursuant to Quran while upholding a law, then I'm sure as a believer he would believe that he will be given due reward for that as well. Now, we should also understand that a lot of Quran or something that was being referred to by a lot of jurists as ethics of the Quran, most of those ethics today have been codified in modern law as offenses. And there are a lot of legislation that so the sin of yesterday is an offense of today. So it was a sin or a guna, किसी को आपने मारना नहीं, कत्ल नहीं करना. Today it's an identifiable offense under the penal codes of all the states. It was a sin कि आपने किसी को गाली नहीं निकालनी, किसी का मजाक नहीं उड़ाना, तमस्खर नहीं उड़ाना. Today in all penal codes it's an offense identified as defamation and so on. It was ethically required, you have to protect the rights of the neighbors. Today, there are civil laws where city laws provide for protection कि आपने 10 फुट की जगह छोड़नी, क्यों? ताकि आपके पड़ोसी को हवा और एयर और सनलाइट जो है वो मिले. तो प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ दैट राइट्स आर देयर. सो इसी तरह लेबर, समथिंग क्या यू आर रिक्वायर्ड टू इंश्योर कि लेबर को टाइम पे वेजेस मिलें, वो आज इंडस्ट्रियल रिलेशंस लॉ में इनकॉर्पोरेटेड हैं, वो इंडस्ट्रियल रिलेशंस इंटरनेशनल ILO कन्वेंशंस में है. सो आई थिंक अ बिलीवर हैज़ टू सी दिस कॉमनैलिटीज़ कि कल जो कुरान का जो ट्रीटी लॉ है वो जो कह रहा था उसके हवाले से जो स्कॉलर्स ने उसको गुनाह का कॉन्टेक्स्ट दिया था वो अपनी जगह दुरुस्त, लेकिन अब वो गुनाह को आज का ऑफेंस कहा जाता है. सो इफ यू लुक एट द पीनल कोड, मोर लेस दे डवटेल विद अहकाम कुरान फ्रेमवर्क. सो दे आर नॉट sometimes when people say कि जी ये अंग्रेज़ों का बनाया हुआ कानून है और हम इसको नहीं मानते, या इस तरह की बात करते हैं, respectfully submitted, I think that is, you have to see कि अगर वो जो formulation जो codified है, if it is reflecting some aspect of the Quran, then you should comply it with an intent कि you're complying with the Misaq framework of the Quran. So that will ensure that discipline within the state, which will not, उसमें because state को सबसे बड़ा problem क्या आता है हर state को, या ख़ास तौर पर मुसलमानों की state को, to ensure compliance of laws. So compliance of laws सिर्फ पुलिस ने करवाना है, या FIA ने करवाना है, या custom agencies ने करवाने की बजाय अगर कोई शख्स ये सोचे कि it is an obligation on me that I have to fulfill that, और वो internalize कर ले. So this is the purpose of Quranic Covenant Research Center, this select purpose. So QCRC is aimed at developing this narrative that you have to uphold private contracts with each other, you have to uphold international treaties, and you have to uphold legislative covenants of the state. Obviously, there could be some laws which are oppressive, or some laws which may be against some specific provisional. वो आप ना comply करें, उनके खिलाफ आपको protest करने का हक है. You can challenge them. That thing apart. But the fact is कि most of these legislations पाकिस्तान में ये एग्जामिन किया गया जो कि about 90% या 95% of कवानीन या legislation जो है 8,000 कवानीन फेडरल हैं प्लस 3,000 प्लस प्रोविंशियल हैं, तो इनमें से तकरीबन 95% जो है दे आर नॉट इनकंसिस्टेंट विद द कुरान. सो वो तो कंप्लाई विद होने चाहिए. सो देयर कुड बी एन इशू विद अ फ्यू हियर एंड देयर. So I think that is what we need to tell people, that while fulfilling Quran, while fulfilling the law of the land, they are also fulfilling the mandate of the Quran.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to end it on, because I think having read this and also having listened to you, I think the main aim of this is to bring about a behavior change, a change in your approach into how you look at the law and how it applies on you. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for this fantastic discussion.